May 14, 1945. Sugarloaf Hill, Okinawa. A 19-year-old corporal from East St. Louis, Illinois named James Day, crawled into a shell crater on the forward slope of a 50-foot hill and waited for what was coming. He had 12 men with him. By morning, 6 of them were dead. He stayed anyway. 3 days later, when the Marines finally reached his position, the men who found him counted the bodies around his foxhole. 107 Japanese soldiers. James Day was still in that crater. Wounded twice. Machine gun destroyed. Down to his rifle and whatever grenades he could reach off the dead men around him. He had not given a single foot of ground. There is a detail about that hill that does not appear in most history books. While James Day was holding that crater on the forward slope, a Japanese colonel named Hiromichi Yahara was inside a tunnel beneath Shuri Castle, less than a mile away, reading the casualty reports coming in from Sugarloaf. Yahara was not an ordinary officer. He had spent 2 years living in the United States as a military exchange officer. He had walked American streets. He had eaten in American diners. He had studied the way Americans think, the way Americans work, and the way Americans fight. He knew more about the men coming up that hill than any Japanese commander in the Pacific War. He had spent 12 months building the most sophisticated defense in the history of island warfare, specifically to stop those men. And he was watching it fail, one hill at a time, one Marine at a time. What those men did on Okinawa over 82 days, and what it meant for every American family that got their son back instead of a telegram, that is what this video is about. Dear, before we go any further, the men who fought on Okinawa are almost all gone now. The youngest would be in their late 90s. Most of them never talked about it very much. If your father or your grandfather was there, if you grew up hearing the word Okinawa at the dinner table, spoken in a way that meant something you were too young to fully understand, hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it's the only way this story reaches the people who spent their whole lives not knowing what that man went through. In 1933, the Japanese Army sent a young staff officer named Hiromichi Yahara to the United States. He was 30 years old, born in Tottori Prefecture, the son of a small landowner. He had come up through the military academy the way capable, serious men did in Japan at that time, by being better than everyone around him and not calling attention to it. His superiors described him as quiet, methodical, a man with what one officer later called a supreme eye for terrain, the ability to look at a piece of ground and immediately understand how it could be used, how it could be held, and how it could kill the men who tried to take it. He arrived in America with a notebook and a mission. What he saw was not what Tokyo expected him to see. He traveled to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, attached to the 8th Infantry Regiment for several months. He watched American soldiers train. He watched them in the field. He sat with them, ate with them, and observed the thing that Tokyo's intelligence assessments had consistently failed to account for. These men were not soft. They were not the demoralized, undisciplined soldiers that Japanese military doctrine described. They were competitive in a way that was hard to put into words, not driven by orders, but by something that came from inside, something that had no clean equivalent in the Japanese military vocabulary he had grown up with. He wrote about it, not in an official report, in his private notes. He was trying to name something he had seen and could not yet explain. He came back to Japan in 1935. For the next 9 years, he rose steadily through the ranks, staff positions, teaching strategy at the Army War College, a 3-month posting in China. He was not a man who sought the spotlight, but by 1944, the men who made decisions knew exactly who to call when they needed someone to think through a problem that no one else had been able to solve. In March of 1944, Yahara was assigned to Okinawa. His orders were simple, in the way that impossible assignments always are. The Americans were coming. Everyone knew it. Okinawa sat 350 miles south of the Japanese home islands, the last stepping stone before the mainland. Whoever held Okinawa controlled the staging ground for everything that came next. Yahara's job was to make certain that taking Okinawa cost the Americans more than they were willing to pay. He had 12 months to prepare. And unlike every other Japanese commander who had faced this problem on every other island, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Yahara had actually seen the men who were coming. He had eaten at the same tables, watched them train, read their doctrine, understood the thing that Japanese intelligence reports consistently got wrong. He did not build his defense based on what Tokyo told him about American soldiers. He built it based on what he had seen with his own eyes in 1933. The first thing Yahara did was tear up the standard plan. Every island defense in the Pacific War had followed the same logic. Meet the Americans at the waterline, hit them while they are most vulnerable, in the water, in the surf, climbing out of landing craft. It had never worked. At Tarawa, the garrison had built one of the most fortified beach positions in the Pacific. 14 coastal guns, concrete bunkers, interconnected pillboxes, months in construction. The Marines had taken it in 76 hours. At Saipan, the Japanese had defended the beaches and lost the island in 3 weeks. At Peleliu, they had begun to learn. At Iwo Jima, they had gone underground. Yahara read every after-action report the Japanese military had produced from those battles. He read the analysis. He read the diaries recovered from American dead. He read the interrogation transcripts. And he drew one conclusion, that almost no one in the Japanese high command was willing to say out loud. The Americans do not stop. You can hit them at the water. You can kill the first wave and the second wave. You can make them pay for every yard of beach. They will still come, not because of orders, not because their officers are watching, because the man next to them has not stopped yet. And stopping before that man does is something they cannot bring themselves to do. Yahara had seen it in 1933, before the war, before a single shot had been fired between the two countries. It was the thing his notes had been trying to name. Now, with 12 months and an entire island to work with, he built his defense around it. If the Americans cannot be stopped at the water, he reasoned, then meet them somewhere that turns their strength against them. He walked Okinawa. Every ridge, every ravine, every piece of high ground in the southern half of the island. He was looking for terrain that would force American firepower, the naval guns, the artillery, the close air support that had demolished every Japanese position on every previous island, to become useless. He found it in the limestone ridges running across the southern end. The rock was riddled with natural caves. Decades of phosphate mining had carved out shafts that ran deep into the hillsides. Yahara did not see caves. He saw fighting positions that a naval shell could not touch. He saw tunnel systems that could absorb a 3-day bombardment and put men back at their weapons before the last echo had faded. He saw a terrain feature that the Americans, for all their firepower, could not simply blow into rubble from a safe distance. They would have to come in close, man by man, hole by hole. For 12 months, Yahara built. Steel doors that could be slid shut faster than a naval shell could locate and answer a muzzle flash. Firing positions cut at angles that made them nearly impossible to hit directly from outside. Tunnel systems connecting caves on multiple levels, so that when one position was taken, the defenders could withdraw underground and reappear at the next position before the attacking Marines had time to consolidate. He calculated the heat. In open terrain on Okinawa in late spring, ground temperature reaches 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the caves, it was 20 degrees cooler. Every hour, an American soldier spent moving across open ground in full gear in that heat, was an hour he could not sustain at the same intensity. The island itself would do part of the work. He calculated the math. If each of the island's defenders could force the Americans to kill him at a high enough cost in men and material, not win, not stop them permanently, but make the price steep enough, then the men planning the invasion of the Japanese home islands would look at Okinawa and understand what a landing on Kyushu would cost. That was the mission. Not to defeat the Americans, to make certain that the men in Washington who were running the numbers on the next operation could not look away from what those numbers said. On April 1st, 1945, Yahara stood on the crest of Shuri Castle with his commanding general, Lieutenant General Ushijima, and watched through binoculars as 60,000 Americans walked ashore unopposed. The naval guns had been firing for 7 days. The beach below was torn earth and smoke, and the Americans were walking in upright, not crouching, not running from cover to cover, walking, like men who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. Yahara watched. When the shelling had lifted and the first wave touched the sand, and nothing happened, no Japanese guns, no defenders, no resistance at the waterline. One of the staff officers next to him looked at the smoke still hanging over the empty beach and muttered something about the waste of ammunition. Yahara said nothing. He already knew what was about to happen. He had built the defense. He had read the reports. He had seen what those men were capable of long before a single shot had been fired between the two countries. The men walking off those landing craft were not going to stop. Not at the beach, not at the first ridge, not when one unit was spent and another took its place. He had designed the most sophisticated killing ground in the Pacific War to extract the highest possible price from exactly these men. And he already understood, standing on that castle wall, watching 60,000 of them walk ashore, that it was not going to be enough. The Americans had a name for April 1st, 1945. They called it Love Day, L-Day, the L standing for landing. April Fool's Day happened to fall on Easter Sunday that year, and the men climbing into their landing craft before dawn were aware of both. Nobody was laughing. The men in those boats had fought before. Veterans of Tarawa knew what the water looked like when the first wave hit a defended beach. Veterans of Peleliu knew what it felt like to step off a landing craft into the concentrated fire of a position that had been zeroed in on that exact stretch of coral for months. Veterans of Guadalcanal knew what a jungle looked like when the Japanese were still in it. These were not green troops. They knew what a Japanese defense felt like before it showed itself. They knew it always ended the same way. At 8:32 in the morning, the first wave touched the beach at Higuchi. The landing craft dropped their ramps. The men went over the sides. Nothing happened. They stood on the beach. They looked at each other. They looked at the ridgeline. Silence. A veteran sergeant from the 7th Infantry Division wrote about it afterward. He had been in the Pacific since 1942. He had been on beaches where the men in front of him died before their boots were dry. He wrote, "We kept waiting for it. Every man on that beach was waiting. And it didn't come. And that scared us more than if it had. Because every man who had survived a previous landing knew what the silence meant." The Japanese were not gone. They were waiting. And every yard the Americans moved inland, every easy step across ground that should have been defended and wasn't, was a yard closer to wherever the Japanese had chosen to make them pay. By the end of Love Day, American forces had pushed 2 miles inland. They had seized both airfields. Casualties were almost nothing. The generals who had planned for disaster looked at the maps and dared to think the worst was already over. For 3 more days, it stayed that way. The men moved south and north across open ground that should have been killing them. They passed through villages that had been evacuated. They walked through Japanese supply depots, still stocked with food and equipment, abandoned in perfect order, as if the men who had built them had simply stepped away for a moment and would be right back. A veteran who had fought in earlier Pacific campaigns described those first days in a letter home. He wrote, "I don't know what to make of it. We keep moving, and nothing happens. The fellows who were at other islands say it's the quiet that worries them. Me too. I keep thinking about what they must be saving it for." He was right to worry. They were wrong. On April 4th, the 7th Infantry Division turned south toward the Shuri Line. The first patrols came back with reports of fire from positions that could not be located, snipers that were there, and then were not, ground that looked empty, and then killed you. By April 8th, the men who had been walking upright 4 days earlier were crawling. The steel doors had started to open. What happened next does not compress easily into a story. It lasted 82 days. Every one of those days was the same, and everyone was different. And the men who came home from it spent the rest of their lives finding words that were never quite right. The Shuri Line ran across the southern third of the island like a spine buried in rock. It was not a line in the way that word usually means, a trench, a wall, a position you can point to on a map. It was a system. Every hill covered the hill next to it. Every cave covered the approach to the cave above it. You could not take one position without exposing yourself to fire from 3 others. And underneath it all, the tunnels connected everything, so that a position you had cleared in the morning could be occupied again by nightfall, by men who had moved through the rock while you were consolidating on the surface. The Marines of the 1st Division hit the eastern anchor of that line, Wana Draw, Wana Ridge, a horseshoe of broken ground and fortified limestone that the 1st Division fought over for 3 weeks before they broke through. The 6th Marine Division moved down the western coast and ran into the anchor on the other side. 3 hills, Half Moon, Horseshoe, and a 50-foot rise of bare rock and scrub grass that the maps called Hill 52 and the Marines called Sugarloaf. Sugarloaf does not look like much, 50 feet high, maybe 300 yards long. A low, rounded hill that a man in good shape could climb in 2 minutes. On May 12th, the 1st Marines who saw it thought they could take it in a morning. Company G of the 22nd Marines attacked at first light. They were driven off. They attacked again, driven off again, 4 times that first day. Each time they reached the crest, fire from Half Moon and Horseshoe, the 2 hills flanking Sugarloaf on either side, came down on them from angles they had not covered, from positions they could not see. The hill was designed so that taking it cost more than anyone could afford to pay. Company G started May 12th with 215 men. By nightfall, they had 75. The next morning, the 22nd Marines attacked again, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Over 8 days, Sugarloaf was assaulted 11 times by 3 Marine regiments. Regiments were reduced to the size of companies. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons. Platoons were wiped out to the last man and replaced by the remnants of other platoons. Progress was measured in yards, sometimes in feet. On some days, it was not measured at all. On May 14th, James Day led his men into a shell crater on the forward slope and set up a defensive position. He had 12 Marines with him. By morning, 6 were dead. Day had taken 2 wounds, white phosphorus burns and fragmentation. His machine gun had been destroyed by a mortar round. He was fighting with a rifle and whatever he could reach from the men around him. He did not pull back. That night, the Japanese attacked his position 5 times. Day stopped every attack. The second day brought more. When the attacks paused long enough to count, there were more than 70 enemy dead around one foxhole. On the 3rd day, the Japanese came at dawn. a final push to take back what they had lost. Day killed 12 of them at close range. When the Marines came up to relieve his position, they counted the bodies. 107, around one shell crater, held by one corporal from East St. Louis, who had started with 12 men and finished with 1. Here is what James Day said about those 3 days. Awards weren't on our minds in those days. We just had a job to do, and we wanted to get the job done. That was it. That was all he said. The men who survived Sugarloaf moved on to the next hill. That was the thing that Yahara, in his tunnel, could not account for in any calculation. Not the courage of one man. He had planned for courage. The replacement. Every unit that fought itself down to nothing on Sugarloaf was replaced by another unit that climbed the same hill, knowing exactly what had happened to the men before them. Sergeant Dick Whitaker of the 29th Marines was asked about that years after the war. He was asked how a man could go up that hill, knowing what the hill had already cost. He said, "I was taught to follow orders." On May 18th, the Marines took Sugarloaf and didn't give it back. 2,662 casualties in 8 days, on a hill 50 feet high. The fall of Sugarloaf broke the western anchor of the Shuri Line. On May 29th, Marines of the 1st Division seized Shuri Castle, the ancient fortress that Yahara had used as his headquarters, the center of the entire defensive network. They raised the American flag over its ruins. Yahara moved what remained of his army south to the tip of the island. The Marines and army followed, hill by hill, cave by cave. For 3 more weeks, the same pattern continued. Units took a position, were relieved, were replaced. Nobody stopped. On June 21, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended. 82 days. More than 12,000 Americans killed, 36,000 wounded, the most costly amphibious operation in American military history. 2 days before it ended, Lieutenant General Ushijima called Yahara into his cave on Hill 89. He told Yahara what he had decided. He and General Cho were going to die the way Japanese officers died when their position was lost. Yahara was not permitted to do the same. Ushijima said, "If you die, there will be no one left who knows the truth about the Battle of Okinawa. Bear the temporary shame. Endure it. This is an order from your army commander." Ushijima and Cho died on the morning of June 22nd. Yahara disguised himself as a civilian. He walked down the hill alone into a country that had already surrendered the island, but had not yet surrendered the war. He was captured 3 weeks later. In Washington that summer, President Truman sat with his generals and looked at the Okinawa numbers. His planners were asking him to approve the invasion of Japan itself. Operation Downfall, a landing on Kyushu in November, a second landing near Tokyo in the spring. Herbert Hoover had submitted a memorandum estimating American losses in a full invasion of Japan at 500,000 to 1 million dead. The military planners used Okinawa as their model. One general summarized what they were looking at in 7 words: an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The army had already begun preparing for those casualties. Over the course of the war, the United States had manufactured more than 1.5 million Purple Heart medals. Production peaked as the military geared up for the invasion of Japan. When the war ended, after accounting for every American killed and wounded in every theater since Pearl Harbor, nearly 500,000 of those medals were still in the warehouses, unused. Those medals were still being awarded to American soldiers wounded in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq and Afghanistan. The stockpile from a war that ended in 1945 lasted into the 21st century. A Vietnam veteran who learned that his Purple Heart had been struck in 1945 for the invasion of Japan said he would never look at it the same way again. He was right not to. Truman made his decision. On August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The men who had been rehearsing the invasion of Kyushu stood down. The 12,000 Americans who died on Okinawa did not live to see what their 82 days made possible. But the men who did not die, the hundreds of thousands who were already on the lists for the next operation, whose names had already been assigned to units that would have gone ashore at Kyushu, those men came home. Okinawa is part of the reason they did. 28 years after the battle, Yahara published his memoir. He called it The Decisive Battle for Okinawa. His American interrogator, Frank Gibney, who had come ashore at Okinawa with the American forces and later spent years translating Yahara's account into English, wrote the foreword. In it, Gibney described what Yahara had told him during their conversations after his capture. Yahara had talked about the Americans the way a man talks about something he has spent a long time trying to understand. He had watched them for 12 months from behind his defense. He had seen what happened to units that were broken against the Shuri line. He had watched the replacements arrive. He had read his own reports as position after position fell, and another Marine unit appeared to take it from the beginning. He had one word for it: relentless, the same word he had been reaching for in his private notes in 1933, in a mess hall at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, watching American soldiers train before either country had fired a shot at the other. He had finally found it. 32 years later, on an island that those men had taken one hill at a time, James Day's Medal of Honor paperwork was lost in the fighting on Sugarloaf. Most of the men who had witnessed what he did were killed before the battle ended. Day came home. He went back to the Marine Corps. He served in Korea. He served in Vietnam. He never pushed to have the matter reopened. In 1980, a retired Marine found faded carbon copies of a Medal of Honor recommendation in an old box, May 1945. A corporal named James Day, Sugarloaf Hill. It took another 18 years to move through the system. On January 20th, 1998, 53 years after 3 days on that hillside, President Clinton pinned the Medal of Honor on Major General James Lewis. Day, United States Marine Corps, retired. Day stood in the White House and said what he had always said: "We just had a job to do." He died 9 months later. He is buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, California. The hill he held is now in the middle of a shopping district in Naha, Okinawa. A water tower on the summit, a small monument at the base, stores and restaurants on all sides. Most people who walk past it every day have no idea. If your father or your grandfather served on Okinawa, the 1st Marines, the 6th Marines, the 7th Infantry, the 96th Infantry, any ship in that harbor, any plane off that island, leave his name in the comments below, his unit, where he was, one thing he said about it, if he ever said anything, or just his name, and the fact that he was there. Those men came home from an island that the man who built its defenses called the most relentless fighting he had ever seen. They came home. They sat at dinner tables. They raised families. They grew old. Most of them never said much about it. But the word that the enemy used to describe them, the man who knew them better than any of his contemporaries, who spent 2 years studying them and 12 months building everything he had to stop them, that word is the right one. Don't let their names disappear.